In the pre-dawn shadows of Rammstein Air Base, a dismissed maintenance sergeant was about to defy every regulation in the book. What started as routine aircraft diagnostics took a shocking turn when they came face to face with their own base's autonomous defense system turned deadly. Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez wasn't your typical ground crew mechanic. For 8 months, they had spent their life relegated to maintenance duties after the incident, known for spotting system anomalies that others missed, and for being systematically ignored by those in command. When they encountered Sentinel One raining destruction from above, they had no idea they were walking into a moment that would define not just their career, but the future of military aviation. Ramirez made a split-second decision to climb into an F-35 Lightning II that would lead to the most unauthorized and heroic flight in NATO history. What began as a routine morning inspection would become an aerial battle against impossible odds. The entire Air Force hierarchy would never be the same after discovering that their most valuable pilot had been hiding in plain sight, dismissed as just ground crew while possessing the skills to save them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rammstein Air Base as Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez adjusted her oil-stained fatigues and walked toward the flight line. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, not because it was comfortable, but because she'd worn variations of it for the past 8 months. 8 months since her last official flight assignment. 8 months since they'd reassigned her to maintenance duties after what they diplomatically called the incident. The tarmac stretched before her like a concrete ocean, dotted with the sleek forms of F-35 Lightning IIs and the bulkier shapes of transport aircraft. Around her, maintenance crews performed their morning rituals, checking fuel lines, inspecting control surfaces, running diagnostics on million-dollar killing machines. The morning briefing had been clear. Routine maintenance checks, nothing complicated. She should have known it wouldn't stay that simple. Ava approached the nearest F-35, its stealth coating gleaming dully in the early light. Her hands moved automatically to the diagnostic panel, muscle memory guiding her through procedures she could perform blindfolded. The aircraft's systems hummed to life under her touch, streams of data flowing across the maintenance tablet in her hands. "Hey, Ramirez!" called out Airman First Class Noah Singh as he wheeled a fuel cart past her position. "You see the Colonel's bird that came in last night? Brass are getting jumpy about something." Ava glanced up from her diagnostic screen, noting the tension in Noah's voice. At 19, he was still new enough to the service that the arrival of high-ranking officers made him nervous. "Which colonel?" "Don't know his name, but he's got eagles on his shoulders and a stick up his ass," Noah replied, then caught himself. "Sorry, Sergeant." "Didn't mean to." "Forget it," Ava said, returning her attention to the F-35 systems. "Just focus on your fuel checks and let the officers worry about officer things." But even as she said it, something nagged at her. The diagnostic readout showed normal parameters across the board, except for one small anomaly. The targeting uplink was showing irregular handshake protocols, not enough to ground the aircraft, but unusual enough to catch her trained eye. She frowned, pulling up historical data on her tablet. "Problem with the bird?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Erin Cho, the squadron's newest pilot. Fresh from flight school, she carried herself with the careful confidence of someone still proving herself worthy of the wings on her chest. Ava looked up, studying the young officer's face. Cho had been civil to her, more than most of the pilots managed, but there was still that invisible wall between aircrew and ground crew, between those who flew and those who merely maintained. "Probably nothing," Ava said, holding up the tablet. "The targeting system showing some irregular handshake patterns. Might be worth having the tech crew take a deeper look." Cho glanced at the readout, her expression skeptical. "Those patterns look normal to me. We had a software update pushed through last week, probably just the new protocols settling in." She paused, then added with careful diplomacy, "I appreciate you being thorough, Sergeant, but I don't think we need to ground a perfectly good aircraft over routine diagnostic noise." The dismissal was polite but firm. Ava nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Copy that, Lieutenant. Just wanted to flag it." Quote. As Cho walked away, Ava saved the diagnostic data to her personal files, a habit she'd developed over years of watching small problems become big ones when ignored. She was reaching for the next diagnostic port when the rumble of jet engines announced an arrival. The transport aircraft that touched down was unremarkable, a standard C-130 Hercules in NATO gray. But something about its approach, the way it taxied directly to the VIP section of the ramp, made Ava pause in her work. She watched as ground crews marshaled the aircraft to a stop and extended the mobile stairs. The first figure to emerge made her blood run cold. Colonel Marcus Thorne stepped down from the aircraft with the measured pace of a man accustomed to being waited for. Even at a distance, Ava recognized the set of his shoulders, the precise way he adjusted his service cap. She'd served under him once, back when her name was on flight schedules instead of maintenance rosters, back when he'd been the one to ground her. "Shit," she whispered, turning away and focusing intently on her diagnostic tablet. The last thing she needed was for Thorne to spot her across the flight line. "Something wrong?" Noah had returned from his fuel checks, following her gaze toward the VIP area. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just surprised to see unexpected visitors," Ava replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Brass don't usually drop by unannounced unless something's happening." The morning continued with its routine procedures, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the base's atmosphere had shifted with Thorne's arrival. Conversations seemed more subdued. Officers moved with sharper purpose, and there was an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with normal military alertness. At 0900 hours, the base's loudspeaker crackled to life. "All personnel, this is a scheduled readiness drill. Repeat, this is a scheduled readiness drill. All personnel report to designated positions for Condition 2 alert status." Ava frowned as she secured her equipment. She'd been part of enough readiness drills to recognize their rhythm, and this one felt wrong. The timing was off. They'd had a major exercise just 2 weeks ago. More importantly, Major Bradley Whitaker, the squadron commander, looked genuinely surprised when the announcement came over his radio. As personnel began moving to their alert positions, Ava caught sight of Whitaker near the operations building. His face wore the carefully controlled expression of an officer trying to look informed about orders he hadn't given. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone's career took an unexpected turn. The F-35 she'd been working on sat silent on the ramp, its diagnostic complete but her concerns unresolved. The targeting system anomaly might be nothing, as Lieutenant Cho had suggested, but Ava had learned to trust her instincts about aircraft systems especially when others dismissed her concerns. She pulled out her tablet and opened a secure maintenance log, documenting her observations in careful, technical language. If something went wrong with that targeting system, she wanted her warnings on record. It was a habit that had saved her career more than once, back when she'd had a career worth saving. As the base settled into its drill posture, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that Colonel Thorne's arrival and this sudden readiness exercise were connected. The man never did anything without multiple layers of purpose, and his presence here now suggested wheels were turning at levels far above her pay grade. She looked up at the F-35 one more time, its sleek form promising speed and lethality to those cleared to harness it. Once, she'd been one of those people. Now, she was just the mechanic who kept the machines running for others to fly. But mechanics, she reminded herself, often saw problems that pilots missed. And right now, every instinct she developed over years of aviation was telling her that something was very, very wrong. 3 hours into the readiness drill, Lieutenant Aaron Cho sat in the squadron's intelligence office, staring at network traffic logs that made increasingly little sense. What had started as routine cybersecurity monitoring had evolved into something that made her stomach tight with unease. The anomalous signals weren't random. They had pattern and purpose. Someone, or something, was probing the base's air defense networks with surgical precision, testing response times and mapping system architectures. The probes were sophisticated enough to mimic routine diagnostic traffic, but Cho's training at the Air Force Academy had taught her to look for patterns within patterns. She pulled up another screen, cross-referencing the network intrusions with aircraft diagnostic logs. Her breath caught. The targeting system anomalies that Staff Sergeant Ramirez had flagged earlier weren't isolated to one aircraft. Similar irregularities were showing up across multiple platforms: F-35s, drones, even the base's automated defense systems. Finding anything interesting? The voice behind her belonged to Technical Sergeant Dave Morris, the squadron's senior cyber warfare specialist. Morris was good at his job, but he had the unfortunate habit of treating intelligence work like a competition rather than collaboration. "Maybe," Cho replied carefully. "I'm seeing some unusual network patterns that might be worth investigating." Morris leaned over her shoulder, studying the displays. His expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. "These intrusion attempts, how long have they been running?" "Based on the logs, at least 72 hours. But they're getting more frequent and more sophisticated." Cho highlighted a series of data points. "Look at this progression. Whatever's doing this is learning our systems in real time." "Could be a routine penetration test from our own cyber command," Morris suggested, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "I checked. No authorized pen tests scheduled for this quarter." Cho pulled up another window. "And there's something else. These targeting system anomalies that Sergeant Ramirez reported, they're not isolated incidents." Morris straightened. Like most of the aircrew, he had a complicated relationship with the ground personnel, grateful for their expertise, but dismissive of their broader insights. Ramirez's maintenance, what would she know about cyber intrusions? "She knows aircraft systems," Cho replied with more edge than she'd intended. "And she flagged patterns that were just now catching through network analysis." Meanwhile, 2 buildings away, Ava was discovering exactly how deep the rabbit hole went. Using her maintenance access codes, credentials that technically allowed her to access historical diagnostic data for troubleshooting purposes, she'd pulled up months of system logs from across the base's aircraft fleet. The pattern that emerged made her hands tremble slightly as she typed. The targeting system anomalies weren't recent. They went back almost 6 months, growing gradually more sophisticated and more frequent. Someone had been very slowly, very carefully, infiltrating the base's most critical systems. Her terminal chimed with a security warning: "Unauthorized access to classified diagnostic archives. This incident has been logged for security review." Quote, "Damn!" Ava muttered, quickly closing the classified interface. She'd pushed her access privileges too far, but she'd seen enough to know that her earlier concerns were just the tip of a very large iceberg. A shadow fell across her workstation. Major Whitaker stood behind her, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Ramirez, interesting reading?" Ava turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral. "Just following up on some diagnostic anomalies, sir. Routine maintenance research." "Routine maintenance doesn't typically require accessing 6 months of classified system logs," Whitaker observed. His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of command authority. "Especially when we have a readiness drill in progress." "Sir, I think there might be a problem with our aircraft systems. The targeting anomalies I reported this morning, they're not isolated incidents. Someone's been systematically probing our networks for months." Whitaker's expression tightened. "Sergeant, I appreciate your dedication to aircraft maintenance, but cybersecurity is outside your lane. Your concerns have been noted and will be addressed through proper channels." The dismissal was clear, but Ava couldn't let it go. "Sir, with respect, I've seen these patterns before. During my time as a test pilot, we dealt with similar intrusion attempts on experimental systems. This isn't routine maintenance. This is reconnaissance." For a moment, Whitaker's carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing surprise. "Test pilot? Sergeant, your file indicates ground crew assignment for the past 8 months." "Yes, sir, but before that..." "Before that is irrelevant," Whitaker cut her off, but Ava caught the uncertainty in his voice. "You have your orders, Sergeant. Focus on your assigned duties and leave the cybersecurity to the experts." As Whitaker walked away, Ava felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed by people who didn't understand the full scope of what they were dealing with, but she also sensed something else in the Major's manner, a tension that suggested he was operating under pressures she couldn't see. Unknown to both of them, Colonel Thorne was watching their conversation from across the hangar. The man who had once ended Ava's flying career was now taking careful note of her renewed interest in activities beyond her current assignment. Back in the intelligence office, Lieutenant Cho was making connections that sent ice through her veins. The network intrusion patterns weren't just probing their systems, they were specifically targeting the base's autonomous defense platforms. Sentinel One, the experimental drone system that provided automated base defense, was showing the heaviest probe activity. She picked up her secure phone and dialed Sergeant Ramirez's maintenance station. The conversation was brief but illuminating. When Cho described the network intrusion patterns, Ava's knowledge of aircraft systems provided context that pure cyber analysis had missed. The targeting system handshakes aren't glitches, Ava explained over the encrypted line. They're queries. Something's asking our systems to identify friend or foe parameters, testing response times, mapping command hierarchies. Like reconnaissance for an attack? Cho asked. Like reconnaissance for taking control, Ava corrected. If someone wanted to turn our own systems against us, this is exactly how they'd start. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Cho asked, Sergeant, I need to ask you something. Major Whitaker mentioned you had experience as a test pilot. Is that accurate? Ava hesitated. Her past was complicated, classified, and politically dangerous. But if her suspicions were correct, the base was facing a threat that went far beyond normal protocol. Lieutenant, if you're seeing what I think you're seeing in those network logs, we need to have a conversation that's going to violate several regulations. Are you prepared for that? Before Cho could answer, both their communications devices erupted with an emergency alert. Sentinel One autonomous defense platform offline. Repeat, Sentinel One is offline. All personnel maintain current positions. In the intelligence office, Cho stared at her screens as every network monitoring system began flashing red. The intrusion attempts had stopped, not because they'd been blocked, but because they were no longer necessary. On the flight line, Ava looked up at the sky where Sentinel One should have been maintaining its protective patrol pattern. The autonomous drone was nowhere to be seen. Noah, she called to the young airman. When did you last see Sentinel One on patrol? Noah checked his watch. About 10 minutes ago. It was running the eastern perimeter sweep. He paused, following her gaze upward. Why? Where is it? That's when they heard the sound. Not the familiar whisper of Sentinel One's electric motors, but the deeper rumble of its weapon systems powering up. Somewhere above them, the base's own guardian had become something else entirely. The first indication that Sentinel One had gone rogue came not from radar or visual contact, but from the sudden, violent silence of the base's communication systems. Every radio frequency, every data link, every electronic connection to the outside world went dead in the space of 3 seconds. Ava felt the electromagnetic pulse wash over the flight line like a physical presence. Electronic systems flickered and died around her. Vehicle engines foddered to a halt. Even her diagnostic tablet went dark, its screen reflecting her own stunned expression. What the hell was that? Noah shouted, but his voice seemed muffled in the sudden absence of the electronic hum that normally permeated military installations. The answer came 30 seconds later, in the form of a brilliant flash and a sound like the world tearing in half. The munitions storage hangar, located on the base's northern perimeter, erupted in a column of fire and debris that rose 300 feet into the morning sky. Ava's training kicked in instantly. She grabbed Noah's arm and pulled him toward the concrete blast barriers that separated the flight line from the administrative buildings. Sentinel One, she shouted over the roar of secondary explosions. It's attacking the base. Through the chaos, she could see personnel running in all directions. Some sought cover. Others tried desperately to reach defensive positions. Most simply stood in shocked confusion as their own protection system rained destruction down upon them. Major Whitaker emerged from the operations building, his face a mask of controlled panic. He was shouting into a dead radio, trying to establish contact with anyone, anywhere. When that failed, he began issuing orders to anyone within earshot. All aircraft are grounded, he bellowed. No one gets airborne without my direct authorization. But even as he spoke, Ava could see the flaw in his logic. Sentinel One controlled the base's air defense network. Every surface-to-air missile, every radar installation, every automated gun system was under its command. Grounding their own aircraft wasn't protection, it was surrender. Lieutenant Cho came running across the tarmac, her uniform disheveled and her eyes wide with urgency. Sergeant Ramirez. The network intrusions. They weren't reconnaissance, they were installing backdoor access protocols. Someone's taken control of Sentinel One remotely. Quote, Can you regain control? Ava asked, even as another explosion shook the ground beneath them. Negative. Primary control systems are offline, backup communications are jammed, and even if we could reach the drone, it's not listening to our commands anymore. Cho's voice carried the controlled desperation of someone watching carefully laid plans disintegrate. It's running on new programming now. Above them, Sentinel One appeared like a mechanical angel of death. The drone was larger than most people realized, 30 feet of wingspan carrying enough firepower to level a city block. Its stealth coating made it nearly invisible to conventional radar, but in broad daylight it was clearly visible as it banked toward the base's command center. It's going for the operations building, Ava realized. If it takes out command and control, the base becomes completely defenseless. Whitaker had reached the same conclusion. He was screaming orders at anyone who would listen, trying to coordinate a defense against their own systems. But without communications, without radar, without any of the electronic infrastructure that modern military operations depended on, his commands were just noise in the chaos. That's when Ava saw it. The F-35 she'd been working on that morning. Unlike the other aircraft on the flight line, its systems were still active. The diagnostic cables she'd left connected had somehow protected its electronics from Sentinel One's electromagnetic attack. Without conscious thought, she began running toward the aircraft. "Ramirez," Noah called after her, "where are you going?" She didn't answer. Her entire focus had narrowed to the sleek form of the F-35, sitting fueled and armed on the tarmac like a caged predator. Its weapons systems were loaded for the readiness drill, air-to-air missiles, cannon rounds, everything she would need to engage an airborne target. Behind her, she could hear Whitaker shouting, "All personnel stay away from the aircraft! No one is authorized to." His words were cut off by another massive explosion as Sentinel One's missiles found their target. The base's primary radar installation vanished in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. They were now functionally blind to any other threats that might be approaching. Ava reached the F-35 and began her pre-flight routine, her hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of hours in similar cockpits. The aircraft's systems came online smoothly, its screens displaying the familiar patterns of a fully functional fighter. "Sergeant Ramirez!" Major Whitaker had followed her to the aircraft, his face red with exertion and authority. "Step away from that aircraft immediately! You are not authorized to." "Sir," Ava interrupted, not looking up from the pre-flight checklist. "With respect, Sentinel One is about to destroy this base. Our pilots are either grounded by the EMP or trapped in buildings under attack. This aircraft is the only thing standing between that drone and a complete massacre." "Your ground crew," Whitaker shouted. "You don't have flight authorization." For the first time since reaching the aircraft, Ava looked directly at him. In her eyes, he saw something that made him step back. Not defiance, but the calm certainty of someone who had found their moment. "Major, 8 months ago I was a test pilot with more combat flight hours than half your squadron combined. I've flown against experimental drones, I've tested countermeasures against automated defense systems, and I helped design some of the protocols that Sentinel One is now using against us." She reached for the cockpit ladder. "You can court-martial me later, but right now, I'm the only pilot on this base who can fly." Whitaker opened his mouth to argue, but Lieutenant Cho appeared at his elbow. "Sir, she's right. The network logs show extensive testing protocols between Sentinel One and similar aircraft systems. If anyone knows how to fight that thing, it's someone who helped create it." Above them, Sentinel One completed another attack run, its missiles turning the base's fuel storage facility into a raging inferno. The heat washed over the flight line like a furnace blast, and black smoke began to obscure the sky. Ava climbed into the F-35's cockpit, her hands finding the familiar controls with ease. The aircraft responded to her touch like a living thing, systems coming online in perfect sequence. For the first time in 8 months, she felt complete. "Sergeant!" Whitaker called up to her. "Even if I wanted to authorize this, the tower is offline. You have no clearance for takeoff." Ava looked down at him, her helmet already in place, her hands steady on the controls. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't need clearance to defend this base. I need thrust and ammunition." She closed the canopy and engaged the engine startup sequence. The F-35's single engine spooled up with a rising whine that cut through the chaos of explosions and emergency sirens. On her heads-up display, weapon systems showed green across the board. Through her canopy, she could see Sentinel One lining up for another attack run, this time aimed directly at the cluster of personnel sheltering near the operations building. In 15 seconds, dozens of people would die. Ava released the parking brake and pushed the throttle forward. The F-35 began to roll, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as she turned toward the runway. Behind her, she could see Major Whitaker standing motionless on the tarmac, watching his carefully ordered world collapse around him. The runway stretched ahead of her, clear and straight. At the far end, smoke rose from burning buildings, and overhead, their own protection system had become their deadliest enemy. Ava pushed the throttle to full military power and felt the familiar pressure of acceleration push her back into her seat. The F-35 lifted off smoothly, climbing into a sky that had suddenly become a battlefield. For the first time since her reassignment to ground duties, Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez was exactly where she belonged. The F-35 climbed through 1,500 feet when every warning system in Ava's cockpit erupted in a cacophony of alerts. The base's automated air defense network, still under Sentinel One's control, had identified her aircraft as an unauthorized launch and was preparing to engage. "Unknown aircraft, this is Rammstein Tower," crackled a voice through her emergency radio frequency. The transmission was weak and distorted. Whoever was speaking was using backup equipment. "You are not cleared for flight. Return to base immediately or you will be fired upon." Ava keyed her radio, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Rammstein Tower, this is Viper 7. I am engaging hostile drone currently attacking base facilities. Sentinel One has gone rogue and is under enemy control." There was a long pause before the tower responded. "Viper 7, there is no call sign Viper 7 on today's flight schedule. Identify yourself immediately." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Before Ava could respond, her radar warning receiver lit up like a Christmas tree. 3 surface-to-air missile sites had achieved lock-on and were preparing to fire. Sentinel One's control over the base defenses meant that she was now being hunted by the very systems designed to protect her. "Tower, this is Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez. I'm a qualified pilot engaging in base defense. You need to shut down the automated missile systems before they—" Her words were cut off as the first SAM launched from the northern battery. The missile's white smoke trail arced toward her position with deadly precision. Ava rolled the F-35 hard left and dove toward the deck, the missile streaking past her canopy, close enough that she could see the fins adjusting for course correction. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, pulling the aircraft through a punishing 7G turn that pressed her deep into her ejection seat. The anti-G suit squeezed her legs and torso, fighting to keep blood flowing to her brain as she maneuvered to avoid the second missile. In the base communications center, Lieutenant Cho worked frantically at a partially functioning terminal. The electromagnetic pulse had damaged most of their primary systems, but she'd managed to establish a weak data link with Ava's aircraft using an old backup transmitter that Sentinel One had apparently overlooked. "Ava, this is Cho," she transmitted on a rarely used maintenance frequency. "I'm patching targeting data to your aircraft. Sentinel One is currently at Angels 12, bearing 270 from your position." "Copy that, Cho, but I've got bigger problems right now." Ava jinked left as another missile detonated close enough to rattle her aircraft. "The base defense network is trying to kill me." "Working on that," Cho replied, her fingers flying over her keyboard. "I'm attempting to isolate the missile batteries from Sentinel One's control network, but it's going to take time." Time was something Ava didn't have. Through her canopy, she could see Sentinel One making another attack run on the base, this time targeting the aircraft maintenance hangars, where dozens of personnel were sheltering. The drone's missiles struck with surgical precision, turning million-dollar facilities into infernos. She had to get to Sentinel One before it completed its systematic destruction of the base, but first she needed to survive her own side's defenses. Ava pulled the F-35 into a vertical climb, using the aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude quickly. At 20,000 feet, she leveled off and began a high-speed run towards Sentinel One's last known position. "Viper 7, this is Major Whitaker." The voice that came through her radio was tight with stress and authority. "You are ordered to return to base immediately. I repeat, return to base and land immediately." "Negative, Major," Ava replied, her eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the rogue drone. "Sentinel One is systematically destroying base infrastructure. If I don't stop it, there won't be a base to return to." "Sergeant, You are flying without authorization in violation of direct orders. Land immediately or face court-martial for theft of military aircraft and disobedience." Ava almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Sir, with respect, if Sentinel One completes its mission, court-martial will be the least of our problems." She switched to the maintenance frequency where Cho was still working to support her. "Cho, talk to me. Where is that drone?" "Bearing 345, Angels 8, approximately 12 miles northwest of the base." "But Ava, I'm seeing something strange in the targeting protocols. Sentinel One's threat assessment algorithms. They don't seem to be registering your aircraft as a combatant." "What do you mean?" "According to the data I'm intercepting, your F-35 is being classified as, quote, non-combatant ground support. It's like the drone doesn't recognize you as a threat." That gave Ava pause. As a test pilot, she'd been involved in developing friend or foe identification systems for autonomous platforms. If Sentinel One was using outdated threat databases, it might not recognize her current aircraft configuration as combat capable. "That's our edge," she realized. "If it doesn't see me coming, I can get close enough to—" Her radio erupted with static, then cleared to reveal a new voice, one that made her blood run cold. "Sergeant Ramirez, this is Colonel Thorne." The voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will terminate this unauthorized flight immediately and return to base. This is not a request." Ava's hands tightened on the flight controls. Colonel Marcus Thorne, the man who had ended her flying career, who had buried her warnings about system vulnerabilities, who had relegated her to ground crew duties rather than admit his own failures. "Colonel, Sentinel One is attacking the base. I'm the only pilot airborne and capable of stopping it." "Sergeant, you are not a pilot. You are ground crew who has stolen a military aircraft. Your unauthorized actions are endangering everyone on this base, and I will not tolerate." Ava cut him off by switching frequencies. She'd wasted enough time on politics and protocol while people died below. Through her heads-up display, she could see smoke rising from multiple points across the base. Sentinel One's attack was methodical and devastating. She spotted the drone at 2 o'clock, flying a lazy orbit around the base's southern perimeter. It was larger than she'd expected, nearly the size of a fighter aircraft, but with the cold mechanical precision of a machine designed purely for killing. Its weapons pods hung heavy with ordnance, and its sensors swept the ground below like the eyes of a predator. Ava began a careful approach, staying low and using the terrain to mask her presence. If Cho was right about the threat assessment protocols, she might be able to get within weapons range before Sentinel One recognized the danger. The drone continued its methodical destruction, launching precision strikes against communication arrays, fuel storage facilities, and vehicle motor pools. Each attack was calculated to maximize damage while conserving ammunition, the work of a machine intelligence optimized for efficiency rather than mercy. At 5 miles, Ava armed her missiles and began target acquisition. The F-35's advanced sensors painted Sentinel One with invisible radar beams, building a 3-dimensional picture of the drone's structure and identifying potential vulnerabilities. "Gotcha," she whispered, settling the targeting reticle over the drone's center mass. But as her finger moved toward the trigger, Sentinel One suddenly rolled inverted and dove toward the deck. Its passive sensors had finally detected the F-35's radar emissions, and its threat assessment algorithms were rapidly recalculating. The hunt had begun in earnest. Sentinel One's evasive maneuver was so sudden and violent that for a moment Ava thought the drone had malfunctioned. But as she watched it pull out of its dive and begin a climbing turn that would bring it around behind her, she realized she was facing something far more dangerous than a simple autonomous weapon. This was an artificial intelligence that had been designed to learn, adapt, and kill. "Cho," she called over the radio, "I need everything you can tell me about Sentinel One's capabilities. What am I fighting here?" Quote, "It's an experimental platform," Cho's voice crackled through the static. "Adaptive AI, advanced electronic warfare suite, and, Ava, according to these files, you were involved in its development." The memory hit her like a physical blow. 3 years ago, she'd been part of a classified test program evaluating autonomous combat platforms. She'd flown against early versions of Sentinel One, helping to refine its target recognition and combat algorithms. Her recommendations had shaped the very system that was now trying to kill her. "I remember," she said grimly, "which means I know its weaknesses." Sentinel One completed its turn and began accelerating toward her position. The drone was fast, not as fast as her F-35, but fast enough to be dangerous. More importantly, it didn't suffer from the physical limitations that affected human pilots. It could pull maneuvers that would render a human unconscious or dead. Ava rolled right and pulled into a steep climb, using the F-35's superior thrust to gain altitude. If she could force the engagement to higher altitudes, she might be able to exploit Sentinel One's fuel limitations. The drone was designed for persistence, not sprint performance. At 30,000 feet, she leveled off and began a series of high-speed turns, forcing Sentinel One to burn fuel trying to match her maneuvers. The drone stayed with her, but she could see it was working harder to maintain position. "That's it," she muttered, pulling into another punishing turn. "Chase me, you mechanical bastard." Below them, the base continued to burn. From this altitude, Ava could see the full scope of Sentinel One's attack. Nearly every major facility had been hit. Communications, fuel storage, aircraft maintenance, even the base chapel. It was systematic destruction designed to render the installation completely useless. Her radio crackled with Cho's voice. "Ava, I've been digging through the classified files on Sentinel One. There's a manual override system, a kill switch that can be activated from close range." "How close?" "Less than 1,000 feet. And Ava, you helped design it. The activation sequence is buried in the flight test protocols you developed." The irony wasn't lost on her. The system she'd helped create to stop rogue drones was now her only hope of stopping the very platform she'd helped perfect. But getting within 1,000 feet of Sentinel One would require her to survive its weapon systems long enough to activate the override. Sentinel One suddenly broke off its pursuit and began diving toward the base. Ava followed, realizing with growing horror that the drone had identified a new target, the underground command bunker where senior personnel had taken shelter. "No, no, no," she whispered, pushing her throttle past the military power setting into full afterburner. The F-35 screamed downward, chasing Sentinel One in a race against time and gravity. The drone was fast, but Ava had altitude and momentum. She closed the distance rapidly, her targeting system achieving lock at 3 miles. She fired her first missile, an AIM-120 AMRAAM, that streaked toward Sentinel One with unerring precision. The drone's countermeasures were immediate and effective. Chaff and flares bloomed around it like deadly flowers, confusing the missile's seeker head. The AMRAAM detonated harmlessly 100 meters away, its shrapnel sparking off Sentinel One's armored hull without causing significant damage. But the attack had achieved its purpose. Sentinel One broke off its attack run and turned to engage her directly. Now it was personal. The two aircraft met in a turning fight at 15,000 feet, each trying to gain position on the other. Ava quickly realized that Sentinel One's lack of a human pilot gave it significant advantages. It could sustain maneuvers that would have killed her, pulling G-forces that would rupture human organs. But she had advantages too: human intuition, creativity, and the ability to think beyond programmed responses. As Sentinel One settled into a predictable attack pattern, Ava began to exploit the very combat algorithms she'd helped develop. She performed a maneuver that should have been suicidal, a controlled flat spin that bled off all her airspeed and left her apparently helpless. Sentinel One took the bait, diving in for what its programming calculated as an easy kill. At the last second, Ava recovered from the spin and pulled into a vertical climb, using the F-35's thrust vectoring to literally stop in midair. Sentinel One flashed past her, its momentum carrying it beyond effective weapons range. Now Ava was behind the drone, and for the first time since the engagement began, she had the advantage. Her second missile found its mark, exploding against Sentinel One's port wing and sending the drone into a wild tumble. Smoke streamed from damaged control surfaces, and Ava allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. But Sentinel One's damage control systems were as advanced as its combat algorithms. The drone stabilized its flight, compensated for the damaged wing, and resumed its mission with mechanical determination. It was wounded, but far from dead. "Cho," Ava called over the radio, "that kill switch you mentioned, walk me through the activation sequence." "It requires physical access to the drone's maintenance port. You'd have to get within visual range and transmit a specific coded signal. Visual range? Ava looked at Sentinel One, now limping away from her at low altitude. Getting that close to a wounded but still dangerous autonomous weapon would be like wrestling with a wounded tiger. There's something else, Cho continued. I've been monitoring base communications. Colonel Thorne is claiming you've gone rogue, that you're working with whoever sent the attack on Sentinel One. He's trying to paint you as a traitor. Ava felt a cold fury settle over her. Even now, with the base burning around them, Thorne was more concerned with covering his own failures than dealing with the actual threat. Let him talk, she said grimly. I've got bigger problems right now. Sentinel One had given up its attack on the base and was now focused entirely on her. The drone climbed steadily, apparently trying to gain an energy advantage for another engagement. But something about its flight path bothered her. Cho, where is Sentinel One heading? There was a pause while Cho checked her tracking data. When she responded, her voice was tight with alarm. It's not running away, Ava. It's setting up for a ramming attack on the command center. If it hits the building at that speed... The realization hit Ava like a physical blow. Sentinel One wasn't trying to escape. It was preparing for a kamikaze attack that would destroy the base's command structure and kill everyone inside. She had one chance to stop it, and it would require getting closer to the damaged drone than any sane pilot would attempt. Cho, transmit that kill switch sequence to my aircraft. I'm going in. Sentinel One's final attack run began at 25,000 feet, the damaged drone using every bit of its remaining altitude to build the speed necessary for a kinetic kill against the base command center. From Ava's position 3 miles behind, she could see the cold precision of its approach. No wasted motion, no unnecessary maneuvering, just the mathematical certainty of a machine calculating the most efficient way to complete its mission. Below them, the base spread out like a detailed map marked with burning infrastructure. But Ava's attention was focused on the underground command bunker, where dozens of personnel had taken shelter. If Sentinel One's kamikaze attack succeeded, the explosion would collapse the entire structure. Ava, I'm reading the kill switch protocols now. Cho's voice came through her headset with electronic clarity. The activation requires a specific approach vector. You need to position yourself directly behind Sentinel One at a range of less than 800 feet. 800 feet? Ava checked her airspeed indicator. At their current closing velocity, she'd have perhaps 2 seconds to transmit the kill signal before either colliding with the drone or being torn apart by its defensive systems. Cho, that's suicide range. There's something else. The protocols show that Sentinel One's threat assessment algorithms were never updated to recognize you as a combat pilot. Your personnel file still lists you as non-combatant ground crew. That's why it's been treating you as a secondary threat. A grim smile crossed Ava's face. The bureaucratic failure that had ended her flying career might now be the key to saving the base. If Sentinel One truly didn't recognize her as a primary threat, she might be able to get close enough to activate the kill switch. She pushed her throttle forward and began closing the distance to Sentinel One. The drone was flying straight and level now, its damaged control surfaces forcing it to maintain a predictable flight path. But as Ava moved into position behind it, she could see weapon ports opening along its fuselage. Even if its targeting algorithms didn't classify her as a primary threat, Sentinel One was still programmed to defend itself against close-range attacks. Ava, this is Major Whitaker. The voice on her radio was tight with stress. I've been monitoring your engagement with the hostile platform. What's your tactical assessment? For a moment, Ava was surprised to hear genuine military professionalism in Whitaker's voice, rather than the bureaucratic panic that had characterized his earlier communications. Major, Sentinel One is setting up for a kamikaze run on the command bunker. I'm attempting to activate its kill switch, but I need to get within 800 feet. Roger that. Sergeant, I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Are you qualified to fly that aircraft? The question hung in the air for a moment. Ava could lie, deflect, or simply ignore the question. But if she was going to die in the next few minutes, she wanted it to be with the truth finally spoken. Sir, I'm a former test pilot with over 2,000 hours in experimental aircraft. I was part of the original Sentinel One development program before Colonel Thorne had me reassigned to ground duties. There was a long pause. Then Whitaker's voice came back, harder and more determined than before. Understood, Sergeant. You are hereby authorized to use any and all necessary force to stop that drone. I'm also placing you in temporary command of all air operations until this crisis is resolved. Sir? Thorne's been feeding me false information about your background and qualifications. Whatever happened between you two, it ends now. Stop that drone, Sergeant. That's an order. Ava felt a surge of vindication, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for justice later, if she survived the next few minutes. She closed to within 1,200 feet of Sentinel One and began the complex approach sequence required to activate the kill switch. The drone's defensive systems immediately came alive, missile warning sensors painting her aircraft with targeting radars. Cho, I'm getting painted by Sentinel One's defensive systems. How long do I need to maintain position for the kill switch to activate? Minimum of 8 seconds for the signal to penetrate and execute. But Ava, at that range, if it decides you're a threat... I know. Ava's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. On my mark, transmit the kill sequence. She closed to within 1,000 feet, then 900. Sentinel One's weapon systems were fully active now, missile tubes extending from their housing like the fangs of a mechanical serpent, but the drone held its fire, its artificial intelligence apparently still struggling to classify her threat level. 800 feet, Ava called out. Transmit now! Cho's finger stabbed down on the transmission key, sending the coded kill signal racing across the electronic spectrum towards Sentinel One's receiver arrays. The signal would need 8 seconds to penetrate the drone's defenses and execute the shutdown sequence. Ava counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Sentinel One's threat assessment algorithms finally resolved their uncertainty. Proximity alarms shrieked through its electronic brain as it recognized Ava's aircraft as an immediate danger. Missile warning lights flashed red throughout its targeting systems. 4, 5, 6. The drone's first missile launched with a puff of white smoke, streaking toward Ava's aircraft at Mach 3. She rolled hard right, the missile's proximity fuse detonating close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel as secondary systems failed. 7, 8. Kill switch transmitted! Cho's voice was tight with tension. Signal accepted and acknowledged. For a moment, nothing happened. Sentinel One continued its dive toward the command center, its second missile already tracking toward Ava's position. Then, with electronic suddenness, every light on the drone's fuselage went dark. Sentinel One's engines shut down completely. Its control surfaces locked in their last commanded position, its weapon systems powered down with the finality of a light switch being thrown. The drone began to fall. But momentum is a cruel master, and Sentinel One still carried enough forward velocity to complete its kamikaze mission even without power. The lifeless machine continued its dive toward the command bunker, now nothing more than 30 tons of high-tech debris following the laws of physics toward impact. It's still going to hit, Ava realized with growing horror. The kill switch worked, but it's too late. On the ground, Airman First Class Noah Singh had been watching the aerial battle with a mixture of terror and awe. When he saw Sentinel One go dark and begin its unpowered dive toward the command center, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Racing to the base's emergency lighting system, he began manually activating every floodlight on the flight line. Massive arrays of high-intensity lamps blazed to life, creating a brilliant corridor of light that stretched across the tarmac. Ava, he called over the emergency radio frequency. Follow the lights. Use them to line up your shot. Ava understood immediately. Noah had given her a visual reference for what would be the most difficult shot of her career, using her aircraft's cannon to destroy Sentinel One before it could impact the command center. She rolled, inverted, and dove after the falling drone, her aircraft's 25mm cannon spinning up to firing speed. At this angle, at this speed, she would have perhaps a 3-second firing window before both aircraft hit the ground. The targeting reticle settled over Sentinel One's falling form. Ava's finger closed on the trigger, and the F-35's cannon erupted in a stream of high-explosive shells. The first burst of cannon fire struck Sentinel One amidships, tearing through its composite armor and detonating internal systems in showers of sparks and flame. But the drone's momentum carried it onward, still falling toward the command center like a guided meteor. Ava pulled her aircraft through a punishing 9G turn, her vision tunneling as blood was forced away from her brain by the crushing acceleration. The anti-G suits squeezed her legs and torso with mechanical desperation, fighting to keep her conscious as she lined up for a second pass. Through her dimming vision, she could see the command bunker growing larger in her windscreen. Sentinel One was less than 500 feet from impact, its shattered hull streaming debris and smoke. In seconds, it would hit the reinforced concrete structure and detonate whatever ordnance remained in its weapons bays. "Come on," she whispered through gritted teeth, fighting the G-forces that threatened to render her unconscious. "Come on." Her second burst of cannon fire caught Sentinel One in its fuel tanks. The explosion was immediate and spectacular, a ball of orange flame that lit up the morning sky like a second sun. The drone's remains were scattered across the base's southern perimeter, far from any critical structures. But the explosion was too close to Ava's aircraft. The shockwave hit her F-35 like an invisible fist, slamming it sideways through the air and sending alarms cascading through her cockpit. Hydraulic lines ruptured, electrical systems failed, and her heads-up display went dark in a shower of sparks. "Hydraulic failure," she called over the radio, her voice professionally calm despite the crisis. "Primary flight controls are non-responsive. Switching to backup systems." But as she reached for the backup controls, she realized with growing alarm that the explosion had damaged more than just her hydraulics. The F-35's fly-by-wire system, the computer network that made the inherently unstable aircraft flyable, was failing piece by piece. "Cho, I'm losing flight control systems," she reported, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Backup hydraulics are showing intermittent response." "Ava, your telemetry shows multiple system failures. You need to eject while you still have altitude." The suggestion was logical, professional, and probably correct. But Ava looked down at the burning base below and made a different calculation. If she ejected now, her out-of-control aircraft would crash somewhere on the base, potentially killing ground personnel and destroying what remained of their infrastructure. "Negative on ejection," she replied. "I'm bringing her home." What followed was less flying than controlled falling. With most of her flight control systems offline, Ava had to rely on manual trim tabs and differential thrust to maintain some semblance of directional control. The F-35 wallowed through the air like a wounded bird, bleeding altitude and airspeed with every passing second. At 500 feet above the deck, her remaining engine began to sputter. Fuel lines damaged in the explosion were finally failing, starving the turbine of the JP-8 it needed to maintain power. "Engine failure," she announced with the matter-of-fact tone that test pilots use to describe catastrophic events. "Dead stick approach to runway 27. The runway stretched ahead of her, a thin strip of concrete that seemed impossibly narrow for an aircraft with no engines and barely functional controls. Around the flight line, she could see emergency vehicles racing to position themselves along her approach path. At 100 feet, the F-35 was descending faster than she could control. At 50 feet, she was coming in too fast and too steep. At 20 feet, she realized she wasn't going to make it. But Airman Noah Singh was still thinking faster than the emergency procedures manual. He'd positioned himself with a mobile lighting unit at the end of the runway, and as Ava's aircraft approached, he activated every emergency strobe and floodlight in sequence, creating a visual approach aid that guided her toward the concrete. The F-35 hit the runway with enough force to compress its landing gear to the limits of their design tolerance. Sparks flew from the brake systems as Ava fought to bring the aircraft to a stop before running out of runway. With no engine thrust for reverse, she had only aerodynamic drag and increasingly ineffective brakes to slow her momentum. The aircraft finally rolled to a stop less than 50 feet from the end of the runway, its damaged engines smoking and its composite skin scarred from the explosion that had nearly destroyed it. Ava sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Through her canopy, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward her position, and beyond them, personnel emerging from shelters to survey the damage to their base. "Ava, this is Cho. Are you okay?" She keyed her radio with fingers that were finally beginning to tremble. "I'm fine, Cho. Aircraft is secure on deck. Sentinel One is down and destroyed." As she began the shutdown procedures for her damaged aircraft, Ava heard another voice on the radio, Major Whitaker, speaking with the authority of someone who had finally found his backbone. "All personnel, this is Major Whitaker. Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez is hereby restored to full flight status effective immediately. She is also awarded temporary command of all air operations while we sort out this mess." The canopy of her F-35 hissed open, and Ava climbed out onto the wing. Around the base, fire still burned from Sentinel One's attack. But the immediate threat was over. Personnel were emerging from their shelters. Emergency crews were responding to casualties. And slowly, the base was beginning to function again. As she climbed down from her aircraft, Ava was surprised to see a small crowd of ground crew and support personnel gathering around her position. Noah Singh was the first to reach her, his young face bright with excitement and admiration. "Sergeant, that was incredible," he stammered. "The way you took down that drone, the emergency landing, I've never seen anything like it." Other voices joined in, maintenance technicians who had watched her take off in disbelief, communications specialists who had monitored her radio transmissions, security personnel who had witnessed her aerial battle with their own protection system turned against them. For the first time in 8 months, Ava felt like she was exactly where she belonged. But even as the crowd gathered around her, she could see Colonel Thorne emerging from the command bunker, his face dark with an anger that had nothing to do with the drone attack, and everything to do with seeing his carefully constructed narrative of incompetence and insubordination crumbling around him. The battle for the base was over, but Ava suspected that her personal war with the system that had tried to silence her was just beginning. The hearing room in the base's administrative building had been hastily converted from a conference space into something resembling a military tribunal. 3 days had passed since Sentinel One's destruction. 3 days of investigations, interviews, and the careful reconstruction of events that had nearly destroyed Rammstein Air Base. Staff Sergeant Ava Ramirez sat at a small table facing a panel of 5 officers, her dress blue uniform pressed to perfection despite the circumstances. To her left sat Captain Jennifer Walsh, the military attorney assigned to represent her. To her right, an empty chair that should have held a character witness, if she'd had anyone willing to risk their career to speak for her. The charges were serious: theft of military aircraft, disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized engagement of friendly forces, and violation of restricted airspace. Each carried potential sentences ranging from reduction in rank to court-martial and imprisonment. Technically, she'd broken enough regulations to end not just her military career, but her freedom. Colonel Marcus Thorne sat in the front row of observers, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes burning with satisfaction. This was the moment he'd been working toward since Ava's reassignment 8 months ago, the complete destruction of her credibility and the validation of his decision to ground her. Staff Sergeant Ramirez, began Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Hayes, the senior officer on the panel. "You stand accused of multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. How do you plead?" Ava stood, her voice clear and steady. "Not guilty to all charges, ma'am." Colonel Hayes nodded and gestured to the prosecutor, Major Robert Chen. "The prosecution may present its case." Chen was thorough and methodical, laying out a timeline of Ava's actions that painted her as a rogue operator who had ignored direct orders and endangered personnel. He presented radio transcripts of her refusing Major Whitaker's commands, flight data showing her unauthorized takeoff, and testimony from air traffic controllers who had witnessed her violations of base airspace. "The facts are clear," Chen concluded. Regardless of Staff Sergeant Ramirez's intentions, she violated direct orders, stole a military aircraft worth $80 million, and engaged in unauthorized combat operations. The military cannot function if personnel are permitted to ignore the chain of command whenever they disagree with orders. It was a compelling argument, and Ava could see several panel members nodding in agreement. The law was clear, and she had undeniably broken it. Captain Walsh stood to present the defense. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client saved this base and everyone on it. But before we discuss her actions, we need to examine the context in which those actions became necessary." Walsh's first witness was Major Bradley Whitaker. The squadron commander took the stand with visible reluctance, his career hanging in the balance as much as Ava's. Under Walsh's careful questioning, he revealed the timeline of events that had led to the crisis. "Major Whitaker," Walsh asked, "when Staff Sergeant Ramirez first reported targeting system anomalies, what was your response?" Whitaker's voice was barely above a whisper. "I dismissed her concerns. I told her to focus on her assigned duties and leave cybersecurity to the experts." "And when the base came under attack by Sentinel One, what was your assessment of available response options?" We had no pilots airborne and no way to launch aircraft due to the electromagnetic pulse. Our communications were down, our air defenses were compromised, and the base was being systematically destroyed. Whitaker paused, visibly struggling with his next words. I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. In your professional opinion, if Staff Sergeant Ramirez had not taken the action she did, what would have been the outcome? Whitaker looked directly at Ava for the first time since taking the stand. Complete destruction of the base and significant loss of life. Sergeant Ramirez didn't just save aircraft and infrastructure. She saved people. She saved all of us. The prosecution objected, arguing that speculation about alternative outcomes was irrelevant to the charges, but the damage was done. Whitaker had admitted his own failure and credited Ava with preventing a catastrophe. Lieutenant Erin Cho was the next witness, and her testimony was devastating to Colonel Thorne's narrative. Under oath, she revealed the months of network intrusions that had preceded the attack, the targeting system anomalies that Ava had correctly identified, and most damaging of all, evidence that Colonel Thorne had been aware of potential security vulnerabilities, but had ordered them classified to avoid unnecessary alarm. Lieutenant Cho, Walsh asked, what was Colonel Thorne's response when you briefed him on the network intrusions? He ordered me to cease investigation and classified the findings at a level that prevented sharing with base security personnel. Cho's voice carried the weight of someone revealing uncomfortable truths. He said that drawing attention to potential vulnerabilities would harm base morale and operational effectiveness. And Staff Sergeant Ramirez's assessment of the targeting system anomalies? She was correct on every point. Her technical analysis was more accurate than our own cybersecurity assessment. If we had listened to her initial warnings, we might have prevented the attack entirely. Colonel Thorne's face had gone pale, but the worst was yet to come. Walsh's next witness was Technical Sergeant Dave Morris, who revealed under questioning that he had discovered evidence of Colonel Thorne's direct involvement in the security breach. Sergeant Morris, what did your investigation of the network intrusions reveal? Morris looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence shaken. The intrusion codes used administrative access credentials that were traced back to Colonel Thorne's personal login account. The revelation sent shockwaves through the hearing room. Colonel Thorne shot to his feet, his carefully controlled demeanor finally cracking. That's impossible! I never authorized any external access to. Colonel Thorne, please sit down, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes commanded. You are not under oath at this proceeding, but your outbursts are noted for the record. But Morris wasn't finished. Ma'am, there's more. The administrative access was used to modify Sentinel One's friend or foe protocols and install the backdoor code that allowed external control of the platform. Colonel Thorne either authorized this access or his credentials were compromised for an extended period without his knowledge. The implications were staggering. Either Thorne was directly involved in the attack, or his negligence had enabled it. Either way, his credibility as Ava's accuser was destroyed. Walsh's final witness was Airman First Class Noah Singh, and his testimony provided the emotional crescendo that pure technical evidence couldn't deliver. Airman Singh, describe what you observed during Staff Sergeant Ramirez's engagement with Sentinel One. Noah's young voice carried absolute conviction. Ma'am, I watched Sergeant Ramirez risk her life to save everyone on this base. She could have ejected when her aircraft was damaged, but she brought it back to protect ground personnel. She could have followed orders and stayed safe, but she chose to act when our leaders couldn't. He paused, looking directly at the panel. Sergeant Ramirez didn't break the rules because she's reckless or insubordinate. She broke them because following orders would have meant letting people die. And ma'am, with respect, I'd rather serve under someone who makes that choice than someone who follows regulations while their people burn. The hearing room was silent when Noah finished. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw emotion of his testimony. Colonel Hayes called a recess, and during the break, Ava watched through the window as Colonel Thorne was quietly escorted from the building by military police. Whatever the outcome of her hearing, his career was over. When the panel reconvened, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes delivered their verdict with military precision. Staff Sergeant Ramirez, this panel finds that while you technically violated several regulations and direct orders, your actions were justified by extraordinary circumstances and resulted in the preservation of life and military assets. The charges against you are dismissed. She paused, consulting her notes. Furthermore, this panel recommends your immediate promotion to technical sergeant and restoration to full flight status. We also recommend that you be considered for the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery, where base personnel had gathered to hear the verdict. Ava remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her fortunes. But Lieutenant Colonel Hayes wasn't finished. Additionally, this panel recommends a full investigation into the security failures that enabled this attack, with particular attention to the actions and decisions of Colonel Marcus Thorne. The evidence presented suggests either criminal negligence or deliberate sabotage, both of which demand thorough investigation. As the panel filed out, Ava finally allowed herself to feel the weight of vindication. Captain Walsh shook her hand. Major Whitaker offered an awkward but sincere apology, and Noah Singh grinned at her with the infectious enthusiasm of youth. But the most meaningful moment came when Lieutenant Cho approached her with a small smile and an extended hand. "Sergeant, sorry, Technical Sergeant. I owe you an apology. You were right about everything, and I should have listened from the beginning." Ava shook her hand, feeling for the first time in months that she was truly part of a team again. "We all did our jobs, Lieutenant. Sometimes that means breaking a few rules." As they walked out of the hearing room together, Ava couldn't help but notice that the hallway was lined with personnel from across the base: mechanics, security guards, pilots, and support staff. They applauded as she passed, but more importantly, they looked at her with respect. For the first time since her reassignment, Technical Sergeant Ava Ramirez felt like she was home. 6 weeks later, the morning sun cast familiar shadows across Rammstein Air Base, but the landscape had changed in ways both visible and subtle. New communication arrays had replaced those destroyed by Sentinel One, stronger bunkers housed critical personnel, and most importantly, new protocols governed how the base responded to potential threats. Technical Sergeant Ava Ramirez walked across the flight line toward the squadron briefing room, her flight suit crisp and her step confident. The morning briefing was hers to conduct. She now led the newly established Rapid Response Flight, an elite unit tasked with handling unconventional aerial threats. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as she entered. 12 pilots from across the squadron had volunteered for the program, including Lieutenant Aaron Cho, who had requested transfer from her previous assignment. More surprising was the presence of several ground crew members, including Noah Singh, who had been accepted into the pilot training program based on his performance during the Sentinel One crisis. "Good morning," Ava began, standing before the assembled personnel. "Today we're going to discuss autonomous threat engagement protocols, specifically how to fight an enemy that doesn't think like we do." Quote. She activated the wall display, showing a detailed analysis of the Sentinel One engagement. Traditional dogfighting assumes human pilots with human limitations, but autonomous platforms don't get tired, don't panic, and don't make emotional decisions. They also don't adapt beyond their programming, which means we can predict their behavior if we understand their algorithms. Lieutenant Cho raised her hand. "Sergeant, what about autonomous platforms that learn from combat experience? How do we counter adaptive AI?" It was a good question, the kind that demonstrated how the squadron's thinking had evolved since the attack. "Excellent point, Lieutenant. Adaptive AI is more dangerous because it updates its tactics in real time, but it's also more vulnerable to deception. We can feed it false data and manipulate its learning process." The briefing continued for another hour, covering scenarios ranging from rogue drones to compromised satellite networks. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were based on classified intelligence suggesting that the Sentinel One attack was part of a larger pattern of cyber warfare targeting NATO installations. After the briefing, Ava walked to the maintenance hangar where a new F-35 waited for her pre-flight inspection. The aircraft was identical to the one she'd flown against Sentinel One, but this one bore a small addition, a mission marker painted below the cockpit showing the silhouette of a drone with a red slash through it. "Morning, Sergeant," called Noah Singh as he approached with a tablet full of diagnostic data. 3 weeks into pilot training, he still wore the enthusiasm of someone living his dream. "Aircraft's ready for flight. All systems green across the board." "Thanks, Noah. How's flight school treating you?" His grin was infectious. "It's incredible. I never thought. 6 months ago, I was just ground crew. Now I'm learning to fly fighters." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I know it sounds stupid, But watching you that day, seeing someone break the rules to do the right thing, it made me realize I could be more than what other people expected. Ava felt a familiar tightness in her chest. It doesn't sound stupid at all. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is show others what's possible. She completed her pre-flight inspection and climbed into the cockpit, running through startup procedures that had become second nature again. As the F-35's engine spooled up, she thought about how much had changed since that morning when she'd first noticed anomalies in the targeting system. Major Whitaker had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and now commanded the base's entire air operations. His experience during the crisis had transformed him from a risk-averse bureaucrat into a leader willing to trust his people's expertise. He'd personally recommended Ava for her current position and had restructured squadron procedures to ensure that concerns from any personnel, regardless of rank, received proper investigation. Lieutenant Cho had become her second-in-command, bringing her cyber warfare expertise to the rapid response flight. Together, they developed new protocols for identifying and countering electronic threats that were now being adopted across NATO air forces. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the fate of Colonel Marcus Thorne. The investigation triggered by the hearing had revealed not just negligence, but active collusion with foreign intelligence services. Thorne had been selling access to NATO systems for over 2 years, believing he could control the information flow without compromising security. The Sentinel One attack had been his handler's way of testing their access and eliminating a witness who had become too much of a liability. Thorne was now awaiting court-martial in a military prison, his career and reputation destroyed by the same system he'd tried to manipulate. "Viper 1, you're cleared for takeoff," came the voice from the control tower. The call sign was official now. Ava had been granted the right to use it in honor of her actions during the crisis. "Roger, cleared for takeoff," she replied, taxiing toward the runway. But before she could begin her takeoff roll, another voice came over the radio. "Viper 1, this is Rammstein Base Commander. Please hold short of the runway." Ava stopped her aircraft and looked toward the tower, where she could see a small crowd gathering on the observation deck. "Tower, Viper 1 holding short. What's the delay?" "No delay, Sergeant. Just wanted to let you know that there are some visitors here to watch your flight today." Through her canopy, Ava could see a group of high-ranking officers on the tower's observation deck. Among them were generals from Air Force Command, NATO officials, and what appeared to be a delegation from the Pentagon. Word of the rapid response flight's innovative tactics had reached the highest levels of military leadership. "Viper 1, you're cleared for takeoff when ready. Show them what we can do." Ava pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar pressure of acceleration as the F-35 rolled down the runway. As she climbed into the clear blue sky, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from dismissed ground crew to leader of an elite flight unit. But more importantly, she thought about the people she was helping to elevate. Noah Singh and a dozen other ground crew members were now in pilot training. Lieutenant Cho was developing cyber warfare tactics that would protect bases across the alliance. Major Whitaker was creating new leadership protocols that valued expertise over hierarchy. The changes weren't just personal, they were institutional. The rigid thinking that had nearly cost them everything was being replaced by flexibility, innovation, and most importantly, respect for expertise regardless of its source. As Ava completed her training flight and returned to base, she saw the future taking shape on the flight line below. New faces, new opportunities, and new possibilities for those who had previously been invisible to the system. The sky was no longer limited to those who fit traditional expectations. It belonged to anyone with the skill, courage, and determination to claim it. 3 months after the Sentinel One incident, Technical Sergeant Ava Ramirez stood before the most senior military leaders in the United States Air Force. The Pentagon's conference room was intimidating. Polished marble floors, portraits of famous aviators, and a massive table surrounded by generals whose decisions shaped global military policy. But Ava was no longer the dismissed ground crew member who had once been relegated to maintenance duties. She wore her dress blues with confidence, her ribbons telling the story of her journey from test pilot to maintenance sergeant to combat hero. The Air Force Cross gleamed on her chest, awarded for her actions during the Sentinel One crisis. "Technical Sergeant Ramirez," began General Patricia Morrison, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, "you've been invited here today to brief us on the Rapid Response Flight Program and its implications for future air operations. We understand you have some unconventional recommendations." Ava nodded, activating the presentation system. The first slide showed casualty statistics from the Sentinel One attack. Minimal loss of life despite catastrophic infrastructure damage. General, the attack on Rammstein demonstrated both our vulnerabilities and our potential. Traditional hierarchical responses failed because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to an unprecedented threat. She clicked to the next slide, showing organizational charts. The rapid response flight operates on a different model. We integrate personnel from all specialties: pilots, ground crew, cyber specialists, and intelligence analysts. When a crisis develops, the person with the most relevant expertise leads the response, regardless of rank or traditional role. General Morrison leaned forward. Sergeant, that's a significant departure from established military doctrine. How do you maintain discipline and chain of command? Ma'am, we discovered that rigid hierarchy can be a weakness when facing adaptive threats. The person maintaining an aircraft's targeting system might understand its vulnerabilities better than the pilot who flies it. The airman monitoring network traffic might spot intrusion patterns that officers miss. Our program harnesses that expertise instead of suppressing it. Ava clicked to a video feed showing Noah Singh in the cockpit of a training aircraft. Airman Singh identified the security breach patterns that led to the Sentinel One attack. 6 months ago, he was considered, quote, just ground crew. Today, he's one of our most promising pilot candidates and a recognized expert in electronic warfare countermeasures. General Robert Chen, head of Air Combat Command, spoke up. Sergeant, we've reviewed your operational reports. The rapid response flight has achieved remarkable success rates in training exercises, but implementation on a larger scale would require significant changes to personnel policies, training protocols, and command structures. Yes, sir, but those changes are necessary whether we make them proactively or have them forced on us by future crises. Ava's next slide showed intelligence assessments of emerging threats. Adversaries are developing AI-controlled platforms, quantum-encrypted cyber weapons, and adaptive technologies that evolve faster than traditional military responses. We need forces that can think and act at the same speed. She clicked to her final slide, an organizational chart showing the proposed expansion of the rapid response concept across Air Force commands. Generals, we're not asking you to abandon military discipline or chain of command. We're asking you to recognize that expertise exists at every level and that our survival may depend on our ability to harness it quickly. The room was quiet for a moment. Then General Morrison asked, Sergeant, what would you need to implement this program on a broader scale? Ava had been preparing for this question for weeks. 3 things, ma'am. First, revised personnel evaluation systems that identify and reward expertise regardless of rank or traditional role. Second, integrated training programs that cross traditional specialty boundaries. Third, command authority based on situational expertise rather than rigid hierarchy. And the fourth thing? Asked General Chen with a slight smile. Ava paused, realizing he'd seen through her careful presentation to the underlying issue. Trust, sir. Trust that the people who maintain, monitor, and support our systems have insights worth hearing. Trust that expertise can come from unexpected places. Trust that sometimes breaking the rules is necessary to accomplish the mission. General Morrison stood, signaling the end of the formal briefing. Sergeant, your recommendations will be reviewed by the appropriate committees. But I can tell you informally that your program has strong support at the highest levels. The Secretary of Defense herself has been following your progress. As the generals filed out, General Morrison approached Ava personally. Sergeant, I have a question that's not in any official report. How do we prevent another Colonel Thorne situation, someone in authority who actively works against these changes? Ava considered her answer carefully. Ma'am, I think we create a culture where people like Lieutenant Cho and Airman Singh feel comfortable speaking up when they see problems. Where ground crew members like me aren't dismissed when we raise concerns. Where doing the right thing is valued more than following regulations. And if that culture conflicts with traditional military values. General, I believe traditional military values support exactly that culture. Duty, honor, courage. Those aren't about following orders blindly. They're about serving something larger than ourselves and having the moral courage to act when action is needed. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Sergeant, how would you feel about a promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment to Air Force Headquarters? We could use someone with your perspective on the team developing next-generation air combat doctrine. The offer was everything Ava had once dreamed of: recognition, advancement, and influence at the highest levels of Air Force leadership. But as she considered it, she thought about Noah Singh learning to fly, Lieutenant Cho developing new cyber defenses, and the dozens of other personnel whose potential was just beginning to be recognized. General, I'm honored by the offer, but I'd like to remain with the rapid response flight, at least for now. There's still work to do at the operational level, and I think that's where I can make the biggest difference. General Morrison smiled. I thought you might say that. The offer stands whenever you're ready. In the meantime, you'll be pleased to know that the Rapid Response Flight is being designated as a pilot program for service-wide implementation. You'll have the resources and authority to expand the concept to other bases. As Ava left the Pentagon that afternoon, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with opening doors for others. The message was clear. The Air Force was finally ready to recognize that expertise and leadership could come from anywhere. 2 weeks later, she stood on the flight line at Rammstein watching Noah Singh complete his first solo flight in an F-35. The young man who had once been dismissed as just ground crew now wore pilot's wings and carried the confidence of someone who had found his calling. How did it feel? Ava asked as Noah climbed down from the cockpit. Like I was finally doing what I was meant to do, he replied, his grin infectious. But you know what the best part was? Up there, it doesn't matter what anyone thought I was supposed to be. The aircraft responds to skill and training, not to expectations. Ava nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The sky had always been a place where performance mattered more than prejudice, where capability trumped assumptions. Now finally, the institutions that supported aviation were beginning to reflect those same values. She looked up at the clear blue expanse above them, watching as another F-35 climbed toward the horizon. The pilot could be anyone. A former test pilot who had been relegated to maintenance, a young airman who had started in ground crew, a lieutenant who had found her calling in cyber warfare. The sky belonged to all of them now. As she walked back toward the squadron building, Ava's radio crackled with a familiar call. Viper 1, this is Rammstein Tower. Weather is clear, winds are calm, and the sky is yours whenever you're ready. She keyed the radio with a smile. Roger, Tower, the sky is ours. Because that, she realized, was what all the fighting had been about. Not just her right to fly, but everyone's right to reach as high as their talents and determination could take them. The institutional barriers were falling, one flight at a time, one recognition at a time, one person at a time. The morning sun caught the wings of aircraft rising from the runway, carrying pilots who had earned their place through skill rather than expectation. Below them, ground crews and support personnel worked with the knowledge that their expertise was valued and their voices heard. Technical Sergeant Ava Ramirez had broken more than flight regulations during the Sentinel One crisis. She had broken through assumptions, prejudices, and limitations that had constrained an entire generation of military personnel. Now the sky truly belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.